Hello everyone. I'm Associate Professor of General Hygiene Department of Sechenov University. Today we consider exposure to the industrial dust.
Industrial dust, or aerosol, is a collection of tiny solid particles produced during the manufacturing process. They are suspended in the air of the working area and having adverse effects on workers' organism. Only particles less than approximately 100 micrometers in diameter have the potential to remain suspended in the air for any length of time to form a hazardous aerosol. This slide represents the size range of different types of occupationally significant particles. The hazard associated with occupational inhalation of aerosols have long been recognized. Lindsay the Elder, in the 17th of our era, wrote of lead inhalation hazards during scraping of lead-containing paint. Agricola in the 16th century and Tremancini in the 17th one described the hazards of aerosols in mining. They were a major topic of writings by Ellis Hamilton as the Industrial Revolution flourished and the field of industrial hygiene evolved in the very early 20th century. The primary route of exposure for most hazardous particular matter is inhalation, with toxicity occurring subsequent to removal of the particulate matter from the aerosol by deposition in the lungs. Some types of particulate matter may be hazardous by ingestion or skin contact. Sir Percival Pott identified cancer caused by skin contact with soot in Mount Chimney Sweep as early as 1775. Lead particles that have settled out of the air onto eating surfaces can be absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract to cause systemic poisoning. Recently, it has been suggested that chronic beryllium disease may be triggered by contact of insoluble beryllium-containing dust with the lips, mouth, or even eyes. Thus, the range of potentially hazardous routes of exposure posed by particulate matter is broader than often recognized. Particulate matter typically encountered in the occupational environment can be divided into a number of types based primarily on how the particulate matter was created, its shape, and its composition. There are several classifications of industrial dust depending on the assessment principle. By the origin of the dust is divided into organic, such as plant, animal, polymer, inorganic, mineral and metal dust, and mixed dust. There are thousands of types of inorganic and organic particulate matter that may be found in the occupational environment. This table lists some of the more ubiquitous particulate matters as well as certain types of particulate matters that are of current special interest in industrial hygiene and air pollution. According to method of formation, occupational dust is divided into aerosols of disintegration that formed during grinding and processing of solids, and aerosols of condensation resulting from the condensation of metal and non-metal vapors. According to the dispersion, dust is divided into visible, microscopic, and ultramicroscopic. Employees are not exposed to single particles, but rather to large masses of particles suspended in air, commonly called a particle cloud. Particle clouds have a variety of characteristics that often must be understood to fully evaluate and control the hazard they may present. Particle clouds may be fairly monodisperse, consisting mostly of particles that fall within a very narrow size range, or polydisperse, containing a wide range of particle sizes. Fog from condensed boiling acid are examples of fairly monodisperse particle clouds. This fork, often called fume by chemists, tends to be formed of larger particles several micrometers in diameter. Fresh welding fume is typically well small, of the order of 0.01 micrometers in diameter. The majority of occupational aerosols generating activities make polydisper particle clouds. Sandblasting usually leaves some of the large incident particles more 100 micrometers unbroken, yet also forms very small fines. The dust action on the human body has a large value, so the dust can be predominantly toxic, dust of such chemical substances as manganese, lead, arsenic, irritating, calcareous, alkaline dust, infectious, dust that contains bacteria and spores, allergic, dust of wool particles, synthetic, carcinogenic, for example, soot, and fibrogenic, when dust exposure leads to specific fibrosis of lung tissue. According to the nature and severity of the pathological process, dust is divided into severe, moderate, and mild fibrogenic, and that have toxic and allergic effects. Hazard of dust is determined by its physical and chemical properties. First of all, the chemical composition of the dust. It's often a primary driver for the toxicity of a material. For example, beryllium is considered more hazardous than lead, which is more toxic than iron. Smoke from petroleum asphalt is considered less toxic than smoke from coal tar, because the latter typically has a much higher concentration of potentially carcinogenic polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. The next property is solubility in biological fluids. Soluble particles pass into the bloodstream and influence on organs and systems depending on their chemical composition. Insoluble particles cause fibrosis of the lungs. The third characteristic is size. Size is important because it determines where in the respiratory tract the particle is most likely to be deposited. The lung has different clearance mechanisms and particle residence times in different sections. In the nose, nasal turbinates and throat, inhaled air moves rapidly through small diameter passageways with several sharp changes in direction. The larger particles, especially those with size greater than 25 micrometers, are subjected to removal by impaction in this area and are either ejected through blowing the nose or passed into the gastrointestinal tract, completely avoiding the lungs. In the thoracic region of the lungs, also known as tracheobronchial region, which includes the bronchi and larger bronchioles, the air slows down because of the greater cross-section of floor, and impaction and inertial setting remove smaller particles between 1 and 20 micrometers. Particles deposited in this region are usually reliably removed from the lungs in a matter of hours by the mucocellular escalator, and thus have a limited residence time in the lung. Finally, very small particles, those with size significantly less than 5 to 10 micrometers, have an increasingly good chance of penetrating all the way to the terminal bronchioles and the alveolar sacs in the air exchange region of the lungs. In this region, they may be deposited by diffusion. Here, the only option for removing the particle is to dissolve it or let the macrophages physically transport it to a nearby lymph node. Particles deposited in the alveoli are attacked by resident macrophages, which attempt to engulf and dissolve them using a variety of digestive enzymes. Particles that are effectively moved from the alveoli by macrophages without dissolution pass into the lymphatic drainage, where they may accumulate, cause illness, or particularly gain access to the systemic circulation. Particles that dissolve naturally are transported directly into the bloodstream by diffusion across the very thin capillaries that line the alveolar sacs. Particles that do not dissolve and are harmful to macrophages are often the serious pneumoconiosis-inducing particles, and they simply accumulate in the alveoli. So, dust particles less than 0.25 micrometers almost no precipitate in the air and are constantly in motion. But dust of less than 5 micrometers is the most dangerous, as it can penetrate into the deeper part of the lungs until the alveoli and retains air. It's estimated that about 10% of inhaled dust particles reaches the alveoli, and 50% is swallowed with saliva. Charged particles in the up to 8 times more active are dilated in the airways and are intense phagocytated. In addition, particles having the sum change are in the working zone air for a longer time than the oppositely charged that agglomerate and settle faster. The deposition rate of dust depends on the shape and porosity of the particle. Rounded, dense particles settle faster. Dense, large, sharp-edged particles, aerosol disintegration usually, more injurious the mucous membrane of respiratory tract than particles with a smooth surface. Light porous particles better absorb toxic fumes and gases, as well as microorganisms and their metabolic products. Such dust becomes toxic, allergic, and infectious. The hazard of dust is also determined by the dose. The dose depends on the concentration of dust in the air and the time of exposure. Most of the pneumoconiosis require many years of exposure for toxic effects to manifest themselves. The same is true of carcinogenic particulate matter, such as polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons and cadmium fume. Some metals, such as arsenic and lead, typically result in poisoning that occurs after exposure of at least several months. A few hours of heavy overexposure to some metal fumes from welding or cutting, such as zinc, can result in a transient illness known as metal fume fever. Of course, all of these time frames are affected by the concentration of the contaminant in the workplace air. Silicosis, a classic pneumoconiosis, can occur in a matter of months when the exposure level is very high. High exposure to cadmium fume can cause acute pulmonary edema, which can be fatal in days. At very high levels, lead toxicity may manifest itself in less than a week. Substantial exposure to particulate matter can result in a wide variety of biological responses, ranging from acute to chronic and from mild to life-threatening. Among them are diseases of the skin and mucous membranes, such as pustular disease of the skin, dermatitis, conjunctivitis, and so on. Then, non-specific respiratory diseases, acute sensory irritation of the upper and middle air passageways, including a burning sensation in the upper airways and coughing from laryngeal stimulation. Continued exposure may result in bronchial constriction. Pulmonary irritants stimulate sensory receptors in the lung and induce rapid shallow breathing, dyspnea, and breathlessness. If the exposure is high enough or prolonged, more severe responses, including airway constriction and pulmonary edema, may occur. Secondary infection may complicate severe cases. Lung edema without sensory irritation may be. For example, cadmium oxide can be fatal by this mechanism in high doses. Some irritants, for example, vanadium compounds, can cause acute to chronic bronchitis, which is the overproduction of mucus and lead to cough and dyspnea. It may be emphysema, which results in obstructive lung function. Particulate matter examples include cadmium oxides and cigarette smoke. Allergic sensitization, resulting in extreme allergical rhinitis or asthma, arises from many exposures. They include isocyanates, certain wood dust, complex biomolecules, mite feces, pollen, cotton bract, mold spores, maple bark, hemophilic actinomyces, and dried sugarcane. The next is occupational poisoning due to exposure to toxic dust. These poisonings include systemic toxicity that is a result from dissolution of inhaled particles in the lungs or in the digestive tract after being removed from the upper and middle airways. Examples of such particles are lead, arsenic, thallium, pentachlorophenol, fluoride salts, manganese, soluble radioactive compounds, and toxic fungal spores. It may be lymphatic toxicity from particles physically moved to the lymphatic system from the alveoli by macrophages. Insoluble radioactive particles may cause this type of damage. Metal fume fever typically resembles flu and results from overexposure to fresh metal particles, especially fume of zinc, magnesium, and copper, or a number of other metals of their corresponding oxides. It tends to occur in employees who have been recently exposed to these fumes. Symptoms start 4 to 12 hours after inhalation and are self-limiting in almost all cases. The next effect is oncogenesis, the inhalation or the initiation or promotion of cancer. Examples are many and includes arsenic, asbestos, beryllium, chromium plus 6 compounds, coke oven emissions, nickel, free crystalline silica, cigarette smoke, and at least certain hardwood dusts. Fibrosis, which is a type of scarring of the lung tissue, results in loss of flexibility, difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, damage of the right side of the heart as it tries to compensate for reduced blood oxygenation. Many of the pneumoconiosis result in fibrosis. There are many different types of fibrosis, some localized and some very diffused. They may present a restrictive or obstructive pulmonary function profile or a mixture of the two. Note that some types of particles can cause a range of lung toxicity depending on the specific compounds containing the active element, the particle size, and the exposure rate. Thus, arsenic can cause pulmonary edema, systemic poisoning, or lung cancer. Secondhand cigarette smoke can cause emphysema, bronchitis, or lung cancer. Asbestos can cause asbestosis or lung cancer. Many of the classic chronic respiratory tract diseases that have been attributed to inhalation of particulate matter result in a type of illness that is broadly called a pneumoconiosis. Derived from Greek, this simply means dust in the lungs. Attempts to define pneumoconiosis were made as early as 1916. There was no universally accepted definition of pneumoconiosis until 1950. A more recent definition of pneumoconiosis is the accumulation of dust in the lungs and the tissue reaction to its presence. Pneumoconiosis are the most interesting group of diseases because professional pneumoconiosis are the most common occupational diseases in the world. Pneumoconiosis can be caused by prolonged exposure to occupational dust. This pulmonary disease is manifested by diffuse chronic pneumonitis with the development of pulmonary fibrosis. Pneumoconiosis develops in workers engaged in the underground work or concentration, coal preparation in the metal industry, metal molders, electric welders, workers of asbestos enterprises, and so on. Pneumoconiosis occurs after 1 to 10 years of working in dusty conditions. It depends on the dust concentration, dust aggressiveness, its dispersibility, individual reactivity, and so on. Heavy physical work, frequent cooling, Simultaneous exposure to irritating gases and toxic substances promote more rapid development of pneumoconiosis. At the same time, disorders of the nervous, cardiovascular, and lymphatic systems are marked. Name of pneumoconiosis or corneal fibrosis is dependent on causative chemical substances. Inhalation of very fine particles of free crystalline form of silicon dioxide causes silicosis, a nodular, potentially progressive and often severe form of pneumoconiosis. Free crystalline silica is the most toxic form of silicon dioxide. Such minerals as quartz cristobalite and tritium contain this form of silicon dioxide. They are all well-defined three-dimensional crystalline structures not bound chemically to other elements. Rocks and soil that contain silicon dioxide chemically bound to other elements are termed silicates. It may have some toxicity of their own, but not generally on the order of free crystalline silica. The disease is caused by silicates named silicatosis. Coal dust leads to anthracosis, asbestos dust to asbestosis. Because asbestos fibers can travel through the lung lengthwise, like an arrow, they can penetrate much deeper into the lung. As a result, asbestos fibers, many tens of micrometers long, can make it to the alveolar region of the lungs. Once deposited in this relatively undefended region of the lungs, it's believed that the fibers trigger an ineffective immune response by resident macrophages. They not only fail to remove the relatively insoluble fiber, but die in the process, setting off a chain of immunological events which result in scarring of the lungs and cancer. So let's summarize our knowledge about dust action mechanism. Most of the particles that reach the deep lung alveoli are inhaled by cells called macrophages. They migrate proximately to the airways and are either expectorated or swallowed, or may enter the interstitial tissues. There, the fibrotic or scar tissue forms around the clusters of macrophages with particles. Gradually, the lung tissue is replaced by fibrotic one. This fibrotic tissue reduces the efficiency of the lungs by making them less resilient and by reducing the effective working surface for gaseous exchange. Pneumoconiosis is manifested primarily by symptoms of respiratory failure. Then symptoms of secondary heart failure are attached. Prevention of pneumoconiosis should be aimed at eliminating the causes of the formation and spread of dust. That is achieved by changing of technological process. I gave some examples in the previous lecture, a change in the physical condition of raw materials. For example, pelletized or briquette forms of material are less dusty. Or replacement of industrial equipment. For instance, the replacement of high-speed rotary discs to low-speed oscillating type greatly reduces the amount of lead dust created at grinding solder seams. Then, the wetting of working procedure, the use of local exhaust ventilation, the removing of dust from working clouds. Of great importance in the prevention of pneumoconiosis is conducting preliminary at entry to the work and periodic during the work medical examination with X-ray examination of the chest. Exposure to ultraviolet rays in some erythemic dose, the use of personal protective equipment such as respirators, gloves, rope, protective creams, and eyewear. Workers who are in contact with dust and have not respiratory disease yet are prescribed inhalations with alkaline solutions to accelerate the removal of dust particles from the respiratory tract. Secondary prevention in patients in the early stages of pneumoconiosis or in a state of pre-existing disease is to avoid exposure to dust, toxic, irritating, and allergenic substances, adverse weather conditions, and strenuous exercise.
That is all about dust. Goodbye.